All right, so this is going to be a really lightning quick, and I do apologize if some of this is a bit lightning, a bit of a brief overview, a teaser of a broader project. So I'm going to try and keep I'm going to try and keep to about 15 or 20 minutes, and then in questions we can focus and drill down on any aspect. First of all, of course, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Gadigal land and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And also, I would like to acknowledge that most of the work that sits behind what I'm presenting today was done on Noongar Whadjuk Budja, where I was also born and raised. And I like to have an image of the Nolak, the black cockatoos here, that really sort of go a little bit towards what Emma was talking about earlier, about the inseparability of cultural, environmental, but also economic and political, in my case, impacts of mining, right? And I would also then like to acknowledge that Indigenous people all over the world, whether it's on Noongar Whadjuk Budja, in Indonesia, or wherever, all around the world, tend to bear the impacts, tend to bear the brunt of the worst of impacts of mining more than other people. So my book project, it's super exciting, will be released hopefully later this year through Manchester University Press under the title Undermining Resistance, Extractive Accumulation, Participation and Governance in Global Capitalism, and simultaneously released as Di Bawah Tanah Berlawanan Pertambangan Multinational di Indonesia through Insist Press in Yogyakarta. And I am super excited about this collaboration that I have with artist and illustrator that I met when I was working at the Agrarian Resource Centre in Bandung, who's illustrating a cover for the books. And this is a work in progress of where he's up to with the illustration. And you can already see here some of the politics of scale emerging and coming to life in some of the activities that the farmers are, they're harvesting or they're planting their crops at that local scale. Then we have this big mining activity that's happening on a larger scale. And at the top, we can see these kind of ghostly at the moment. I like it at the moment how they're still a bit ghostly because they're not coloured in yet. These figures who are involved in negotiating contracts and potentially handing over bribes, whispering in each other's ears. And this is occurring, separate, over, but still somehow connected with all these other local scale activities that are occurring on the ground there. So yes, this extractive accumulation is the overarching framework that I developed in my book that wasn't central in my thesis, and I do have to thank the series editors for pushing me down this pathway. So there were sort of three sets of questions that I was attempting to answer through this research. The first is about this incredible proliferation, this dizzying landscape of global governance standards. Dozens and dozens of organizations, of standards that are created by multinational corporations, associations, multilateral organizations, international organizations, governments, the World Bank's involved. It seems all the time I'm hearing about new standards that are, we are just talking about extractive industries here. So last week I was reading a new one that I hadn't heard of before that's called Energy Resource Governance Initiative, Mineral Sector Governance for a Responsible Energy Transformation. So we have just this incredible proliferation of global governance standards that are mostly private, mostly voluntary. At the same time, we have this rise in participation and in multinational corporations taking on more and more responsibility for managing the environmental and social impacts of mining via the participation or by including the participation of local communities in various mechanisms, right? So these are things like what we call corporate social responsibility, environmental social governance, corporate community development programs, gender mainstreaming, all of these kinds of programs. Yet despite this proliferation of global governance standards on one hand and participation on the other hand, we still see, we still see this endemic conflicts, human rights abuses, conflict, violence, and then the resultant resistance movements, social movements, proliferating from both local scales around mine sites, but then jumping up to via alliances with national and international organisations. So why do we see the emergence of global governance, participation, and resistance, and how are these related? So the questions that I'm interested in is how are these three different realms of action related to each other? What is driving simultaneous processes? Right. I won't go too deeply today into the existing political science and political economy approaches, but it's enough to say that I found the existing approaches to explaining these relationships between global governance, between participation and resistance, less than satisfying because of tendencies to reify particular sites, particular scales, institutions, actors, or strategies. And if we look particularly at this divide between within critical political economy, between on one hand the Marxist structural kind of neo-extractivist approaches to studying conflict around the national scale, so around things like resource nationalism, around industrial policy. And then on the other hand, this micro, everyday political economy approaches that are more influenced by political ecology, by anthropology. That's about how local communities employ different tactics to resist encroachments on their daily activities. This tendency to reify particularly institutions led to two simultaneous literatures that had very contradictory conclusions. The first one about corporate social responsibility, saying that corporate social responsibility is a manifestation of neoliberalism and it's a symptom of neoliberal states. The state is giving more and more grounds to corporations to manage more and more functions that used to be the realm of the role of the state. And then on the other hand, at the same time, there was this rising literature about resource nationalism, right? The observation and question and explanation for why states like Indonesia were able to strong-arm the largest and therefore potentially most powerful multinational corporations in the world to giving up exclusive ownership of large assets in their country. So we have, on one hand, the neoliberal state, the withering of the state. On the other hand, the strong resource nationalist state. How do we bring these two literatures together? How do we reconcile these contradictory conclusions? And, well, to me, it was then obvious at that point needed to bring in a politics of scale in order to examine that relationship between how these two different processes can be happening at the same time, seemingly pulling in opposite directions. And even the reviews on my book proposal came back. The first reviewer said, this is a really good contribution to a kind of post-Marxist debates about extractivism and bringing global governance into Marxist debates. And that's the direction you should lean into, and you should fully follow the implications for global governance. And the second reviewer said, well, your contribution is actually really the fine-grained empirical work that you saw on the ground and the field work that you did in Indonesia. Forget about the global capitalism, go with the local. So of course that meant that I felt like doubling down, and it seemed clear that I needed to work a lot harder to unite the analysis of, to create an analysis of both the corporate strategies and community strategies as a multi-scalar contestation, not as these separate conflicts that are occurring at different sites without being necessarily related to each other. Okay. So then I define extractive accumulation as the collection of strategies and relationships across local, national and global scales that enable corporations to secure access to the natural resources and profit from their extraction within capitalist economies. I think that then begs the question, if I talk about extractive accumulation, what is distinctive, and that says that what is distinctive but not necessarily unique about extractive accumulation. So I'm not saying that extractive accumulation or like extractive capitalism is something entirely separate from other instances of capitalism or accumulation. But what is distinctive about it is the centrality of primitive accumulation, right? The act of land grabbing, of dispossession that must precede the establishment of a mine site, and the resultant rapid change to the pre-existing social relations of production, reproduction, subsistence that existed on that land prior to the dispossession. The primary relationship that needs to be managed following that rapid change to existing social relations is not the employer-employee. It's not a workplace relations exercise. The primary set of social relations that needs to be managed by the mining corporations, sometimes working together with state institutions, sometimes not, is to manage the social reproduction, to manage the social and political relations surrounding the mine site of the local community so that they are not threatening, so that they don't threaten the process of extraction and the ability of corporations to generate profit from the extraction of resources. And what I observe is they do this through what I call a dual-scalar strategy. And so these strategies are not two separate strategies that result from that are responding to two different threats or two different sets of risks, but are two sides of the same coin. So we see a rescaling of governance to the global level. And the example that I use here is Rio Tinto. So early 2000s, Rio Tinto is leading the way in terms of forming international organizations like the International Council of Mining and Metals, working with the World Bank on new standards for mine closure, for land acquisition, so on and so forth. And then on the other hand, they're localizing the management of conflict through corporate social responsibility and corporate community development, consultation, so on and so forth. And this photo I took on field work in upriver, Mahakam River in Kalimantan, where Rio Tinto says here that the Rio Tinto Foundation says that their motto is more worthy to teach a man how to fish than just give him a fish. So the kinds of standards that Rio Tinto was involved in creating and leading the way internationally were then being implemented at the local level as a way to create new opportunities for the local Dayak people. And never mind the ironic statement that, Rio Tinto is saying that they're teaching the local indigenous people there how to fish when they're river people, right? And it's Rio Tinto that arrived and poisoned the river with cyanide and other heavy metals, and then they had to close it to fishing. What Rio Tinto was actually doing is investing in creating cacao plantations, rubber plantations, other forms of economic activities that were both subsistence, productive and socially reproductive, so that those people were not engaging in protests and blockades and threatening the existence of the mine. So together, these dual strategies create what I refer to as the modes of participation, the ideological, the institutional structures for participatory mechanisms that undermine that resistance. They divert the work of activists and opponents at a local scale to other productive activities. Right. So this is my attempt that I made just a couple of days ago to try to represent this multi-scalar process visually. So we start over on the left-hand side here from the land grabbing, from the acquisition, the dispossession, which disrupts the existing relations of production, reproduction, creating conflict. Right. That conflict at the local scale, local activist groups, you know, they can sometimes jump scale through forming national and international alliances. If those national and international alliances have enough success, that can end up creating crises of legitimacy for multinational corporations, threatening their ability to operate as profitably as they otherwise would, who then respond through global governance standards on one hand and localized corporate participation, community development work on the other. That those corporate community development programs about creating new social relations, new productive activities at the local level to solve conflicts, but they may result in new forms of conflict emerging, right? So there may be conflicts over the type, the processes, the ways that consultation is conducted, the amount of compensation. So new conflicts can emerge. New alliances can be formed, and we end up in this sort of spiral relationship that unites each of these processes across multiple political scales. This then begs the question of why particular communities resist. Why do they jump scale? What makes them more or less successful in creating the crisis of legitimacy that corporations need to respond to? And this is an empirical question, and this is sort of what the second half of the book focuses on about understanding comparatively why, when, and how certain strategies are successful for local groups. And the photo here is Jogja Istimewa Tanpa Pengusuran, which means Yogyakarta is special without land grabbing, without evictions. Right? And this is a direct commentary of the local farmers group on the south coast of Kulon Progo and Yogyakarta, saying that really challenging this Istimewa status, this ideology that the Sultan, the royal family in Yogyakarta, has a prerogative, a natural right to all of the land within Yogyakarta. So what I found is that there are these 4 factors I identify: control of land, if the farmers can control their land, can exclude others from taking that land, if they have the organizational capacity that's independent of government, states, corporations, if they have the availability, are there allies available that they can make alliances with at national, international scales in order to make that jump, and ideology then being the 4th factor that kind of unites that brings everything together. Like are they able to develop new ideological frames that can challenge this kind of Istimewa status of the Sultan? And are they able to organize around that? All right, the significance of all of this is that localized conflicts over mining, aggregated up, are generative of global governance mechanisms. Direct relationship between local conflicts aggregated up. And I think this is really significant because in most accounts, local conflicts are seen as only having local effects, right? In terms of a group is able to secure better compensation, a group is able to secure, slightly better environmental controls or whatever the specific effect is that's seen as being quite local. So whereas I'm saying that is actually directly generative of global governance mechanisms and new standards. So I'm providing concrete examples of how that local scale directly constitutes the global. It's not merely being governed or kind of at the mercy of what happens at that global level. And this is kind of some of the conclusions, the significance that I'm wondering if you as geographers think that that's significant, or that's actually just something that happen anyway. Another implication of my arguments and something that I say quite often is that corporate social responsibility is not mere greenwashing. It's actually a material and ideological reorganisation of corporate power in order to contain conflict and continue generating the conditions necessary for profitability. And then finally, do we want to improve global environmental standards? The way to do that is to increase the power of people who are directly affected by mining. So, thanks, and questions?
Okay, so we'll start with some questions.
Hi, Lian. I like your presentation very much. I mean, I like the research. So my question is, when you talk about corporation, who is that? My question is, who is that corporation? Are you talking about the state-owned enterprises, and that's why you said that there is a stronger state power there, or are you talking about like private firms? And my question is also related to, because I think I read somewhere that mining corporations they have a very complex structure, and there is also part of the strategy to actually de-risk their, So sometimes they have these separate legal, entity, separate tax entity, just getting also for this year's money. So I think sometimes it also makes local community confused about who to go against to. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering about, like, when you talk about this corporation, who are they?
That's a really subtle question. So thanks for that. The corporations that I focus on in this study, in my previous work and in my book, are multinational corporations. So they're private. So I'm not talking about state-owned enterprises. I'm not talking about smaller scale I'm not talking about, sorry, I use the word scale far too frequently. It's like the word critical. So I'm specifically looking at multinational corporations, and often the largest multinational corporations. In my study, I was looking, they're all Australian-owned corporations. Yes, right. Okay, so we talk a lot about breaking open the black box of the state and disaggregating all the different state institutions and actors that make up the state. There's an amazing anthropologist of the corporation called Marina Welker who does the same kind of work from a different approach for corporations, breaks apart that black box of the corporation and looks at the different functions of different departments within corporations. So I think that's really valuable work that I do try to go into a little bit as well. So yeah, I think it is important that we don't talk about corporations as singular. They're still constellations of different actors who have different interests within that corporation.
Can you go back to the slide that has your little diagram on it, your circle diagram?
Oh yeah. Slide?
Or is that? I'm just looking at myself in the video points itself directly up my skirt as I sit here. It's quite gross. The video wasn't gross enough. There it is, just there, number 9.
Is that one?
Yeah, okay, so you don't need to go on screen, that's fine. I just wonder where you put like the Indonesian state there, or even the Australian state, if you're thinking about Australian multinational corporations, and the Australian state also regulates those.
So there's 2 big emissions from this, and I sort of stared at this slide for a long time and thought, where can I put these 2 other things that need to go on here? The first is violence, right? So I talk a lot here about governance and participation, but none of that is to suggest that violence doesn't still, and coercive mechanisms don't still underlie or really underwrite, sort of these nicer sounding processes like.
So also where is the accumulation, I guess, in this?
Yeah, and then where is the state? Yeah, the state is the other thing that's missing from this visualization, which is really just a two-dimensional representation of one particular cycle across different political scales. So where does the state?
Well, it just seems to me you've got your crisis of legitimacy there, right? Like states are.
Yeah. So the state. So the crisis of legitimacy can occur, and in that crisis of legitimacy, if this conflict if a conflict is, and I'll give the example of the international campaign against Rio Tinto. Rio Tinto specifically was involved in creating International Council on Metals and Mining, which was one of the leading organisations in creating new governance mechanisms specific to the extractive industries, because they wanted to get in first. They wanted to do that before states like Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, whoever, wherever they're operating, before national states made stricter environmental regulations that wouldn't be private, voluntary, right? So they wanted to be able to say, hey, President, Environment Minister, whoever, don't worry about this, we've got this, we've already reformed our practices, you don't need to create legislation, right? So there is still, in here, there is still a hidden conflict between particularly multinational corporations and state institutions. The other conflict that's occurring at that national level is about resource nationalism, about which corporations, again coming back to state-owned corporations, which corporations are benefiting from this extraction, this accumulation.
Jeff first and then John.
At one point there when you talk, great presentation by the way, lots of things.
So much going on.
Yeah. When you talk about the community development programs, you mentioned a couple of times trying to encourage productive activities.
Yeah.
And you really focus on the word productive.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit more, because it strikes me around a mine site where you're trying to convince farmers to grow cocoa for the world market. It's going to be almost impossible to get their interest because there's so much money floating around the mine itself and spin-off thing. Actually trying to create some sort of an activity that's going to be beneficial to communities is almost impossible from my experience. So I was just curious as to why you're focusing on productive activities and what actually the firms, the companies are trying to achieve with that focus on encouraging productive activity, which it seems to me fail more often than not. So there's something else going on.
You're right in pointing out that, and I mentioned the example of the cocoa plantations around the mine site, around that Kellyan mine site. They fail all the time, and I saw similar things around the production of copra, around the production of cassava factories.
Trying to produce copra when there's all this money floating around the mine site and sort of feeding its way into the community in different ways, and you're trying to make them grow copra. So
yes. So I think what the point is not so much if these attempts to create productive industries or economies is successful or not, but is there enough money and resources being injected into those local communities that diverts the contestation away from the mine. So right, so instead of you and me we're upset because we can't fish in the river anymore, do we go and blockade and disrupt the mine so that they pay us off? Or are there other avenues for us, whether that's employment, if that's scholarships to we can send our children to school and university in the capital city because they're providing scholarships. The mining company, perhaps they're doing construction or providing money for construction in the local village. They're providing all these activities that allow us to sustain our lives, right? And that's, I refer to this as this is part of social relations of production and reproduction. It's giving ways for that community to reproduce themselves that aren't threatening to ongoing extraction and profitability. Does that make sense?
One more question, John.
Yeah, thanks for that. Your answer to Jeff and your talk rings absolutely true of what happened at Bougainville Copper Mine a long time ago. And I think it raises questions about scale in some ways, and particularly what we mean by the local. So for that particular mine, three villages were displaced, not a lot of people. They got land and so on and special treatment, but they were the one real victims. Many other local people nearby really benefited because they had access roads to markets, they had jobs, they had all kinds of benefits from small businesses and so on. So what the local meant is fairly complicated. The second thing I think which is really important about all this is generational changes, generational shifts. So that's more or less what you were talking about in replying to Jeff. So that what really happened in Bougainville over time, that the environment changed and was destroyed for many people. And so people who initially participated began to resist because they could see that land was being destroyed, transformed into just nothing. And so the mine eventually closed when people resisted by firing guns and bringing the thing to an end, but also because there were generational shifts within local communities. So the beneficiaries within the local communities who'd got the landowners, who'd got the resources at the beginning, did not pass that on to the next generation. And they were the ones who became much more critical of the physical changes they saw. And so it's actually, a colleague at ANU has proposed what amounts to a 15-year rule for mining in PNG, that this 15 years, things begin to fall apart because you're now in a different generation. And it sort of works. It worked for Bougainville Copper, it sort of works for Optedi, Porgo, which is now closed, and so on. So I think a big part of it is generational shifts in who are the beneficiaries and who are not.
Yeah, agree with all of that. And another large axis of the way that resources and money is distributed, which I think was the case in Bougainville as well, was along gendered lines. Right? If those resources are distributed to the older men, the senior men in the village, how does that refract through resistance movements? I found that, the gendered impacts of mining, gendered impacts of participation, who's allowed to participate, who isn't, and the way that then changes resistance is really important as well. And of course, Bougainville was the disaster that led Rio Tinto to developing, the International Council on Mining and Metals and other standards.
Okay, thank you very much. That was. Okay, thank you, everybody. We have another session in 2 weeks. That's the last one for Thinking Space this semester.
Thanks, Paul.